Good morning. My name is Peter Hurst. I'm the president and CEO of the Greater New England Minority Supplier Development Council, and I want to welcome you this morning to this webinar that's jointly sponsored by People's United Bank, one of our corporate partners, as well as the Greater New England Minority Supplier Development Council. And we're going to talk today about the whole forgiveness process and criteria with respect to loans issued under the Paycheck Protection Program. Today we have two representatives from People's Bank. We know them very, very well. We have Patrick Laurent, who's the Senior Vice President at People's. He's been there over 17 years, and I had the pleasure before Patrick started at People's of working with him at the Communities Bank in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He's a Morehouse man, and he also has the distinction of being a former board chair for the Greater New England Council. So welcome, Patrick. We also have David Galla, who's the vice president in the business banking group at People's. David has been with People's over 21 years. He's a graduate of the University of New Haven and of the Stonier Banking School. And he's also the former board chair of the Trumbo Chamber of Commerce. So both Patrick and David are very, very knowledgeable bankers. And just for full disclosure, the Greater New England Council applied for a PPP loan through People's Bank, and I must tell you, it was the most incredibly positive experience I've ever had with a bank, in terms of professionalism, in terms of speed, in terms of keeping us informed. So we think very highly of People's Bank, and I personally think very highly of Patrick and David. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Patrick and David to walk us through what you need to do to get your PPP loans forgiven. So, gentlemen, thank you in advance, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate the opportunity to speak, and it's always a pleasure speaking to the council. I was involved with the council for quite some time, so it always brings back fond memories. So I thought I'd start off. We have an agenda, and as you can see, it's on the screen. And I'm going to walk through that agenda. David is going to come into the agenda and talk about a few of the items. But the first thing I thought I'd start off with, where are we now on the Paycheck Protection Program? As you all may know, there are two rounds that the government had approved. Congress that approved the first round, they approved $349 billion. Those funds went very quickly. Within 14 days, those funds were completely exhausted. And then on April 27th, they approved another round of $310 billion. Currently, there's $510 billion from the first and second round, so there's $149 billion still available for PPP loans. So I'm going to walk through the process, but I also want to kind of give you an update because there's been legislation that has been approved, and it's been approved through the House of Representatives, but it has not been approved through the Senate, and nor has the President signed it yet. But those changes will make substantial changes to this presentation. So I'm kind of, I guess, forewarning you that we are anticipating changes to these guidelines, and the most significant ones are right now, the covered period where you can use the funds, the Paycheck Protection funds, is through an eight-week period. The current legislation that has been approved increases that to 24 weeks. So that will bring some change. And also there's proposals that at the moment it's a 24-month loan that all PPP borrowers have. The proposal and where you pay it back interest on no payments for the first 6 months, and then you pay, if there's any balance that's not forgiven, you pay it over 18 months. The new legislation would change that to 24, instead of 8 weeks, 24 weeks. And the repayment would be over 5 years versus 18 months, a year and a half. And also, there's the last proposal is that, or the two other proposals, that instead of paying over, having no payments over the first 6 months, it would be 12 months. And then lastly, currently the way that the program is structured is that you can use 75% of the proceeds for payroll and 25% for non-payroll costs, which we'll go over late in a little bit. But the current legislation would change that to 60-40. So it would be 60% payroll and 40% you can use for other costs, such as rent and utilities and some other costs. So those are going to have significant impact on how forgiveness works and the timing of repayment. Okay, so I preface that this presentation by telling you that there is legislation out there that will change this. But the current guidelines that are out there, and which we will share with you, I know I sent over, and we will share with you all the guidelines, including the application itself, so you'll have that handy. So I thought I'd start off with the forgiveness guidelines themselves. So as I said, at the moment, it's 75-25, and you can use 75% for payroll and 25% for non-payroll expenses such as interest, personal property interest on those notes, rent, lease payments, and I will say that these other costs, or like your lease, would have to be in place before February 15th. You couldn't have a new lease that you could make payments on. That lease would have to have been in place. Also, for your interest payments, your interest payments would have to have been made before 2/15, February 15th. The other things you could do are utilities, such as electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, and internet costs. All those costs could be included in the use of your proceeds. So the timeline and on the repayment is that once you close on your loan, the time begins. So as soon as you close your loan, the 8-week covered period, as they call it, begins. So during that 8 weeks, the expenses that you incur in payroll and those other expenses that I mentioned, those are the expenses that you can apply for forgiveness. So after that happens, during that 8 weeks, and if some of you may have closed at the beginning, so that's right around the corner in terms of 8 weeks. It might be literally in the next couple of weeks that you can start forgiveness. I wouldn't encourage that because there is legislation, as I said, that is probably going to change this. And it's probably to your benefit to wait to apply for forgiveness, especially the fact that, there's no payments for the first 6 months. So once you do fill out that application, which I'll go over, you will submit that application to your lender. Your lender will have 60 days to respond. Okay, your lender will review that, you will submit documentation and the application. We'll go over what that documentation is. And so the lender has 60 days. They will review that. The only, I say, caveat that I'll add to that, the SBA has not announced to banks exactly what we will review. They just said that we will review the application, but they really have not told us the supporting documentation that we have to submit to them, nor how we will submit that to them. So that's a little bit up in the air. That, you know, banks have not gotten you know, full guidance on how to submit that application. So just a little, you know, little caveat there. So a bank will, within 60 days, make their determination. They will either determine that you will qualify for some or all of the forgiveness that you've requested. We will submit that to the SBA, and then the SBA has 90 days to respond and give us a decision to pay on that forgiveness. So as you can see, it's 90 and or 60 and 90. So it's not going to be a quick turnaround to get payment. But once that payment is made, they will pay interest and principal on the amount that is approved. And any payments that you made, so for instance, if for whatever reason, let's say payment had started after the 6 months in this scenario, if you've made those payments will be reimbursed to you, plus interest, okay? So when that determination is made, if you remember at the beginning, prior to PPP, there was a loan program called the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. If any of you have one of those loans outstanding, part of that loan, there was an advance, which is a grant. So that portion where it is a grant will be deducted from your forgiveness amount that you request. So the grant was up to $10,000 on the EIDL loan, and so whatever portion which is a grant on the Economic Injury Disaster Loan that you receive will be deducted from your forgiveness amount. Okay, and if you remember that program, it was 2.75% for nonprofits and 3.75% for for-profits. It was up to $2 million, and the first up to $10,000 was a grant. Okay, and you could have applied when you initially applied for the PPP loan. You could have applied that loan be refinanced or paid for in your PPP loan. So it was right on the application. So now, as I say, the only time that you may not get forgiven if the SBA, for whatever reason, right, determines that you're ineligible. And as you may remember, on the PPP application, you made a certification based on all the various things that application said that you are eligible. So if SBA, for whatever reason, reviews your application and determines that you're ineligible, right, then obviously you will not get forgiven. There's a few examples of that. I mean, the more, I guess, egregious one, or not egregious, but more controversial one is Planned Parenthood. They've put all those applications on hold. I think it's more political, to tell you the truth, but they put all those applications on hold, saying that the SBA does not believe that that entity is eligible, and it was more affiliation that they're claiming that organization is not eligible. So if they do determine that you're ineligible, then there's no forgiveness. The bank will once the bank makes its decision, they are required to notify you within 5 days of their decision. So you will receive a letter from your bank saying that, you know, you're eligible for X amount of money that you've applied for forgiveness. So let's see what else. So in terms of the calculations, I'll go over that in a minute. But what I wanted to talk about is if there is a balance that is due and the total amount is not forgiven, then based on the terms that I just described, and, you know, as I said, at the moment, it's an 18-month repayment period, right? But that could change. So that's what really will happen. It's at 1%, and that the balance will be paid over 18 months at the moment, okay? So I thought I'd kind of go over some of the 8-week period. I mean, that's the only time frame that I can go over now. As I said, it's probably going to change, but at the moment, the covered period, which SBA considers, is the 8 weeks, the 56 days. And the costs that are incurred within that period, those are the costs that you can request as forgiveness. And so one, obviously, it's payroll. And there are 2 ways to consider or report your payroll cycle. It could be one it could be on the date that the loan closes over an 8-week period, or for instance, if you have, you know, you pay your employees bi-weekly, and let's say, you know, your loan closed on a Monday, but your payroll won't start until, you know, the next Friday, that is when your payroll cycle will begin. And so over that period of time for 8 weeks, that will be your 8-week cycle. So it doesn't have to be on the day the loan closed for 8 weeks, but it could be what they are calling the alternative cycle, which is when your next payroll is run through that 8-week period. So things that also that can be covered are, you know, salaries, wages, commissions. If you had folks on furlough and bonus, hazardous pay, all those items can be included in your forgiveness application. Okay. Let's go to the next page here. So now, if you're self-employed or the owner of the company, every employee is limited to $100,000. Okay, so you can't request more than $100,000 for any individual employee or owner. Okay, and the owner, if you're a self-employed owner, you will be limited to your 2019 salary through a 15.38%. It's 8 weeks over divided by 15, and so that will be the limitation of the dollar amount that a self-employed person can request for the forgiveness. You can also include, retirement contributions and health care contributions in that dollar amount. So that's the dollar amount that you can request for self-employed, and then any individual will be limited to up to $100,000. Non-payroll costs that can be included, I talked about with utilities and all those various types of utilities. I also want to talk a little bit about FTEs. And I guess I will let my colleague Dave. I don't know if you want to talk about the FTEs and what the requirements are and what the limitations are on FTEs.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Pat's done a nice job of so far putting all of this into context. My name is Dave Galla. I'm the business banking relationship manager in Southern Connecticut. And I was very honored to be a part of this presentation today for the council. So Pat, thanks for that tee up on the FTEs. It's been a topic of conversation, and most of our customers are asking, the calculation. So if you have an FTE, the way that it's calculated is based on their weekly hours. So if you have a full-time employee, or a full-time equivalent to that, one employee would be a 40-hour work week. If you have two part-time employees, both working 20 hours, they would each be considered a 0.5 employee. So if you had three, two part-timers and one full-timer, that would be the equivalent of 2 FTEs. So at the beginning of your application process, you would have listed your FTEs on the application. And the basics to it is, were your FTEs at the beginning of this process similar to those at the end of this process? So Pat's going to talk a little bit about loan forgiveness based on FTEs, but the way it's calculated is basically their total hours worked versus the number of employees that you have. So if you lost employees during this period of time, or employees have been furloughed and have refused not to come back to work, there are different ways in which those will be handled. But the most important part of the FTE calculation will be the documentation of how those employees were handled during this period of time. So I'm going to turn it right back to Pat, and I hope that helps.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate it. So yeah, just to give you a little bit more detail on FTEs and how to calculate it. So as Dave said, it's a 40-hour week. So if you have somebody, for instance, working 30 hours, right, it would be 75% of one FTE. If you had someone that had 10 hours, it would be, right, 10%. 10%, yeah, 10% of a FTE. So you add all those up on the application, which, is a fairly detailed application. I think it's a 11-page application there. It looks pretty daunting, but it's only really the two first parts of that application that you'll have to fill. The other two are supporting documents that I'll go over. But some of the things in terms of FTEs, I wanted to just point out to you is that if, at the beginning, where the SBA will get that number is literally on your application. So the application that you submitted to your bank, you said there were X amount of employees. That's the amount of employees that the SBA and the bank will use to calculate your forgiveness. So on the forgiveness application, it goes into pretty great detail of how to define that and how to detail the number of employees. So if you made an offer, as Dave said, to someone and they rejected that offer, the number of FTEs in your forgiveness applications will not be impacted. You will not have to reduce your FTEs if you've made an offer and they've rejected that offer. But the key thing is to keep documentation of the written offer that you made and the response from your employee, so that you're not penalized for the FTE. Dave, I'm sorry, I saw you waving there. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, Pat. I'll wait for it to switch over.
Okay, we could hear you.
Oh, great. So one of the things that we have noted in the process is that there are, you as a business owner do have the ability to work with your bank to make adjustments where needed. We've had several applicants who approached us following their loan proceeds, basically indicating that they miscalculated their FTEs or they miscalculated their numbers. So if you've gone through the process and realized that there's been some sort of an error that had been made, it's in your best interest to have a conversation with your bank earlier than later, because we can approach the SBA and work with them on your behalf to help to correct that before the loan forgiveness process is put into play. It's going to be much more arduous at the time, a forgiveness application to make corrections than it would be to get ahead of it. So I'm going to turn it back to Pat. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Dave. So, yeah, so the key to this in terms of the number of employees, as I said, was on your application. And that application was submitted through the SBA through their system called ETRAN. And that's the system of record of the number of employees that you've disclosed to the SBA. Whatever was on your application, your bank has forwarded that to the SBA, and that's the place where it records. So what you want to do is, one, make sure that the bank has recorded the right number of employees on the SBA system. And if for whatever reason, you miscalculated that number, you want your bank to go into the SBA system and correct the number of employees, because that's where SBA will use, that's a system of record to say that those are the number of employees that you had at the time of application. Okay. So documentation. As I said, if you've made offers to employees and they've rejected them, you will not be held accountable, and you can include that FTE in your account. You do have to report that employee to your state unemployment insurance office, and I think that will be a place of record where the SBA may check. So, if you, on your application, you'll detail the number of employees, and if, let's say, for whatever reason, one is not on there because they're not employed with you anymore, but you have documentation showing that they've rejected it, and then if the SBA checks with the Office of Unemployment, it will be recorded there. So, okay. What else? So based on your FTEs on your forgiveness application, you either will get full, forgiveness of the dollar amount that you requested, or it will be reduced proportionally to the number of employees or that you've reported on your forgiveness application. All right, and it will be directly proportionate. And so for other costs, for instance, utilities or interest payments on mortgages or lease payments, any of those costs, telephone, internet, or any of that, those costs have to be incurred during the covered period. So if you read that very detailed forgiveness guideline, it does say that, for instance, let's say you have a bill, your forgiveness stopped on June 1, right? That you went up to June 1, but you have I'll say June 25th, but you don't pay the bill until August 1, right? So whatever proportion amount of money or of that bill that was paid during the covered period will be covered. So it might not be all of the bill, but it might be a proportion of the bill because it will fall, you know, it'll only fall within the covered period. So you will have to provide that documentation, and you will have to provide the documentation that you paid it, and then you'll have to provide a copy of the bill itself. Okay, so for all types of the other costs that I talked about, all those, if you're requesting that those bills be paid and be a part of your forgiveness, you will have to document that. Same thing for your payroll cost. You will have to provide the documentation. Frankly, they haven't told us exactly what that documentation is, but my suspicion is that, for instance, if you have QuickBooks, you run your QuickBooks, a report of your QuickBooks payroll. You provide a copy of the checks that you issued, and that will be, I believe, the sufficient documentation that they will need for payroll. For the other costs, it will literally be a copy of the bill, and then a copy of the check that you made the payment for that bill. Okay. So a couple of other things in terms of reduction of FTEs. There is a what they call the safe harbor period, which was between February 15th and April 26th. So if you made a reduction in your employment or FTEs during that period, you will not be held accountable as long as you rehire those folks, or at least make an offer to them that they rejected by June 30th. Okay, so you will not be accountable during that period, but after 4/26, you will be held accountable. And if you do not, if you made reductions after 4/26, you will be held accountable. Okay, and your forgiveness will be reduced by the number of employees that you reduced after 5/26. Okay, or let's say, for instance, you had employees voluntarily resign, or you had good reason to fire them. You, of course, keep records of that. Or if they voluntarily asked for scheduling reductions, keep record of that. If an employee has voluntarily requested, a reduction in their hours, or voluntarily resigned, you will not be held accountable for that. Okay. So, but documentation, keep your documentation so that you could submit that with your application. Okay. So in terms of, I just want to now go to bank process and SBA review threshold. So the bank's process, I could speak for our process. As I told you what the time frame is, we have up to 60 days to get back to you, right? Some banks will have fintech, that you can just go online and upload your documents. We have that process. We will have a system where you could just go in and go online and do it all yourself, or you can have bankers assist. It depends on the bank that you bank with. Some banks will have an online, some banks won't. Our process is that we will have an online portal where you can go in, request forgiveness. The application will be right online. You could fill it in right online, and you can upload your documents. I know there's probably about 50 banks throughout the country that have an online portal. Not everyone does, And then I told you in terms of the SBA, they will have a 90-day window for them to get back. Now, they did make it clear that they will reserve the right to review any loan, okay, or any application. And loans over $2 million, they've made it clear that they will review every loan over $2 million. They will do a review of every loan that is over $2 million. And so they will review your documents. They will not just rely on what the bank, the bank's task will be to take a look at your documentation, against your forgiveness application and use their best effort, right? Then within a reasonable percentage, right? A bank will just submit your application. If it's off, they haven't told us what that is. They just said a reasonable review. They didn't tell us, 5%, 10%, 20%. They want the banks to make a reasonable review of the application, that the calculations are correct, and then submit it. Okay? But as you can imagine, if it's off 20%, 30%, the bank will work with you until you get to a reasonable amount, a reasonable dollar amount. There will be cases where, dollar amounts are going to be off because of time, So, so any loan over $2 million will definitely be reviewed by the SBA. Okay. In terms of how the bank will help you, I'll let Dave take that, but I will just comment and tell you that I would suggest there are some links that we've provided that Peter and Keith will forward to you that are very good links of all the information. It's on the Treasury site and it's on the SBA site. I'll tell you that the Treasury site is probably much better, much more friendlier than the SBA site. I would go there to get your information. But with that, I'll let Dave. I'll let Dave also comment on how we can help you.
Thanks, Pat. So a lot of information here, and I think that you'll find through this process that you'll be inundated with questions. You'll be inundated with information and documentation requests, and it'll sometimes feel daunting. Just so that our role here, our responsibility is to help you, help our customers, help the council make it through this process as easily and pain-free as possible. But that doesn't mean that it's going to come without some work on your behalf. So as Pat mentioned before, a lot of the process has to do with your documenting basically everything that you've done over the last 8-week period, or potentially longer, depending on what happens in Congress. So how Peoples is going to be helpful. We stand ready to help our customers within our footprint on a daily basis. Our role right now is to communicate as best we can all of the information which we are learning, and which no doubt will change over the coming days, weeks, and months. So our communication is of the utmost importance as we see it. Your role is to communicate back with us, help us to understand what's going on within your business, help us to understand how your document collection process is working, and therefore being able to keep those lines of communication open, making it easier for you when the forgiveness application is actually submitted. On the website, on the Treasury website right now, that application is posted. Very similar to the PPP application process in the beginning, that application may change, but it is there to give you some guidance, to help you to understand what the calculations look like in today's world and how they could potentially help you start the documentation process. Pat mentioned loans over $2 million is being reviewed. I heard, or I saw a note about the number of $2 million loans across the country. I believe there's about 28,000 $2 million loans and above. So this is a tremendous task that's going to have to be done from an auditing standpoint. But don't let that make you feel more comfortable that your loan will not be audited. This is like filing your tax returns. There's a chance you're going to get audited, and the more forthcoming and forthright you are with your information, the easier this process will be. So I just wanted to make that point. So again, how peoples can help. We stand ready through Peter, Keith, and the remainder of the council to answer any questions that may come up, to potentially assist in the remaining 149, I think Pat said, $149 billion that are remaining within this program. And as long as it's within our footprint, within reason, we would be happy to be of service to you. So we are helping our customers, and would love to have the opportunity to work with you if that were to arise. So I think that this is going to be a long process. I think we are all in this, as we know, together. And we stand ready to help rather than to get in your way. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Keith on how Keith and Peter both on how the council can help and what your role in this process looks like. Oop, nope, I'm going to turn it over. I'm sorry. I'm going to turn it over to Pat, who's raised his hand. He has one more thing that he'd like to add first. So Pat, take it away.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Dave. So, yeah, I just wanted to comment on the application. It's a fairly daunting application, but what I will say is that there has been on both sides of the aisle letters that have been sent to the Treasury and the SBA to change this application, because there's been a lot of industry groups and individual borrowers that have just said that this thing is just too daunting. Like I said, it's 11th application. So I know there's an effort now to reduce that application. When and where that's going to happen, I'm not sure. Certainly, if the terms of this program changes, they're going to have to change it anyway. So what I'll comment and just tell you that, as I mentioned earlier, only the first two parts of this application have to be submitted, but because of all the detail in here, what I would suggest to you is that you look at the schedules first, fill those out first, and then fill out the application. Start backwards. The application has the schedules in the back, and it details, your number of employees. Then it details the other costs that I mentioned and how to calculate those. And then it details where you go in your tax filings to get the information to fill out the first two parts of this application. As I say, it is fairly daunting. People have estimated it's going to take hours, 3 to 4 to 5 hours to get this done. What I do know that in each state, the small business development centers will be able to help you. You can, within the state that you operate, you can go to, sba.gov / and then the acronym of your state. What is it, CT or MA or Texas or wherever it is. And it will give you the contact information of where you can go and get help on this application. And that's what I would suggest, is that you either go and visit your the SBA itself or the small business development centers in your individual states. And they will be able to help you through this application. Okay. So with that, again, I want to thank Peter and the council. I do, I know we're going to open it up for questions. So I'm certain hopefully there will be questions. This is a lot of information, but with that, I'd like to turn it over to Peter and Keith.
So David and Patrick, thank you very much. It was very informative, and hopefully everyone has gotten a lot out of that. We will forward the links that you referred to, because I think that will be helpful. And just very quickly, the council has received third-party support to provide technical assistance from the New Haven Foundation, as well as from the Massachusetts Growth Capital Corporation. So if you need help, not only in navigating this forgiveness process, but also if you still haven't applied for a PPP loan, please reach out to us. Keith Greenaway, who's our NBE advisory managing director, is the point person to help you, whether you want to navigate forgiveness or apply for a new loan. Keith, do you want to add anything before we open it up for questions?
Keith, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you, Peter. There's nothing in particular to add, other than to thank both Patrick and David for providing this valuable information to us. We have had a number of questions that actually have come in, and so it's probably useful at this point in time to just raise, just present, some that are recurring questions. The first is the question of taxable income. Is the forgiveness is the loan forgiveness going to be considered taxable income to the company? Do you have any idea about that, David, Patrick?
Dave, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I'll wait to have it come over. So treated like any other loan, this loan is not going to be considered taxable income to your organization. In the event that there are loan proceeds which are not forgiven, that loan will be counted as a loan, again, not as taxable income. So there are no taxation requirements associated with that.
Okay, thank you. The other question that's popped up is the use of qualifying use of the funds that are not payroll uses. So the question that's arisen is whether or not uses such as interest and payments on interest and principal on loans, business loans of the company, payments of general liability insurance, errors and omissions, policies and the like. Is there room for qualifying those as in the currently 25% allocation?
Pat, go ahead.
Sure. So you can request interest, right, but not principal. Only interest would qualify for forgiveness, not principal. Okay. And now they did not say, they had detailed the cost or the different other cost expenses. And let's see, so it's literally interest on loans, okay? And those loans would have had to have been in place before February 15th. And only utilities, which they define as electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, and internet costs. Those are the costs that they've detailed. So, I would go with the fine print, and those are the costs that they've detailed that you can request for repayment and forgiveness.
Okay. Now, another sort of related question is, now when the SBA defines utilities, what's generally, if you know, what's generally included in that sort of the rubric of utilities?
So yeah, so it is literally electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, and internet. In the guidelines, they specifically say those are the expenses. They don't,
Okay.
you know, I did take a look at that, and I thought maybe, you know, there might be other utilities, right? But they don't say other, or you know, they don't name others. They name those specifically.
Okay. So now, just there's one question here that's actually piqued my interest. It basically says what paperwork is needed if a laid off employee does not want to rejoin the company. Is there a way to, is there something that needs to be shown to the government with respect to that? What's required? And then the related question to that is sort of two-pronged, is for purposes, clarify, I know that we touched a little bit on the full-time employees, but so one person said, for instance, they have a part-time employee that works 20 hours a week. So how many part-time employees do you sort of need? You know, what's the minimum amount of hours that's required to be considered an FTE overall?
So the first part of the question, literally, you should have it in writing that you made that offer and that the employee rejected that offer. And so that's the documentation that you'll need. In addition, they did say that if someone I think was laid off, hold on, make sure I get my wording right here. Oh, here. Yeah, if someone was that rejected the offer, right, they had 30 days to respond. And if they don't respond, then you would report them to your state unemployment insurance office, saying that, you know, that they have not accepted that offer. And you keep that documentation, the written documentation that you've sent your employee, and you could submit that with your application in terms of justifying the FTE. In terms of FTE and how you calculate that, it's literally the 40 hours, or, you know, as I said, it's a percentage of it. So if someone works 30 hours, then it's 75%, and it's a percentage of a certain percentage of the 40 hour. 40 hours is considered a full-time employee. Now, there was for part-time employees, if you just go back to it for a second, I'm sorry. So if you have a number of part-time employees, and you know, some companies don't, you know, it sounded a little, I don't know how they do this, but they said that, you know, to reduce the burden on the borrower to produce the number of hours on each part-time employee, if you consider a part-time employee, you can consider them at 50%. So no records are required if a part-time employee is, you know, you say it's a part-time employee in the equivalent of 0.5%. And so, but you have to do that uniformly. So if you said that, you know, you had, let's say, 5 full-time employees and you had 5 part-time employees, each part-time employee could be the equivalent of 0.5%. And so you take that and, you know, so what is that, 2.5 FTEs plus 5 FTEs. Those would be the number of FTEs that you could submit for your forgiveness. So it is very detailed in those guidelines, and I could, you know, I don't know exactly what page it was on, but what I would encourage you is to go to the guidelines and read those. It's very detailed. Those guidelines, it will give you an examples. It will go through examples, each example of types of FTEs, whether they're seasonal employees, non-seasonal employees, how to calculate them. So I would go to the guidelines and really take a look through there to determine what those FTEs are.
And if I could just expand for just one moment on this, and I know that we're getting close to the end of the timing here on this seminar. The SBA website has a frequently asked questions section, which outlines a majority of the questions that we've been asked here today and a majority of the information that's been shared. So I would encourage you to go to the SBA website. Peter and Keith, we will send you that link as well directly to the FAQ section, which will hopefully help the council council members to understand better the questions that they're asking here. So thank you.
Yeah, that's actually on the Treasury site, and I would go there. I would just say the SBA site is just not friendly. So go to the Treasury site, and it shows you the FAQs, and that is, Dave, that is very helpful. They go into, almost every scenario, and I would encourage you to go to the Treasury site and just download the FAQs.
Okay, so thank you so much, David and Patrick. So one last question to sort of close us off. As far as keeping track of qualifying expenses and the like, what's the best practices that you would recommend? Is it having the PPP funds be placed into a segregated account or a sub account and then moving capital funds as needed?
Yeah, Keith, I'll take this one. This has been a hot topic as of late, and when the funding first rolled out, people didn't really know how to handle it. So yes, we are recommending that funds received be placed into a separate account. That way, there is no question on where those funds were derived from, number one, and no question on where those funds had gone. It creates a much more seamless paper trail for the organization. That way, things can be matched up a lot more easily. They don't get commingled with debit card purchases, ACH transactions. Bless you. So we always recommend that people open up a separate account to create an ease of paper trail, number one. And then number two, I think Pat hammered this point home earlier, and I will as well, but document. If you think that there's any scrap of paper that you have that will help in your process for loan forgiveness, hold on to it. QuickBooks or whatever your online software may be can be certainly a great point of contact, but keep that paper because it will help you and your bank to determine your ability to be forgiven in this loan process.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you again, both Patrick and David and Karina. We appreciate your assistance and the information that you were able to convey today to our stakeholders. And with that, I will turn it over to Peter so he can actually close this webinar.
So thank you, Keith, and let me echo the thanks to David and Patrick and Karina. Excellent presentation. We will forward to everyone not only the links that Patrick referred to in terms of the applications, the frequently asked questions, but we will also forward this deck that they put together because it has their contact information. And again, just to echo a point that David and Patrick made at the outset, there's still $149 billion in PPP funds available. So if you have not had a chance to apply and receive PPP funding, I would strongly urge you to take advantage of the fact that the money is still there, because once it's gone, it's probably going to be gone forever. So Patrick, David, Karina, thank you for your excellent presentation. Keith, thank you for parsing through those questions and suggesting solutions to those that were asked. And finally, I want to thank the person who really has been working in the background, Clifton Clark, is our IT specialist, and he has made this as seamless as possible. And for those of you who know me, making technology seamless is hard to do. So again, thank you everyone, and be careful out there, and we will forward this information, and let's make sure you apply as soon as possible so that you can get this process started and get your loans forgiven. So David, Patrick, Karina, thank you again, and thank all of you for attending. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.